February 19th, 1943, in the shadows of the Atlas Mountains, the Kasserine Pass disaster erupted as Erwin Rommel's veteran Afrika Korps shattered the inexperienced U.S. II Corps. This humiliating defeat forced Dwight D. Eisenhower to demand a radical transformation of leadership, clearing the path for George Patton Jr. to seize command and replace a culture of tactical complacency with a relentless, iron-willed discipline that would redefine the American soldier. This was not merely a tactical defeat. It was a profound psychological wounding of the American war machine, where the burning hulls of M3 Lee tanks glowed like funeral pyres against the desert twilight, marking the definitive failure of a command structure that had grown soft, detached, and dangerously insulated from the visceral, lethal reality of modern mechanized warfare. For miles, the roads were choked with the detritus of a fleeing army, abandoned trucks, discarded rifles, and the hollowed-out expressions of young men who had seen their world collapse in a matter of hours. Beneath the surface of this tactical disaster lay a deep-seated systemic rot, personified by the previous commander, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, a man who had orchestrated this catastrophe from a reinforced bunker built by engineers nearly 70 miles behind the front lines, and subterranean fortress known as Speedy Valley that served as a physical manifestation of a bunker mentality. This detachment signaled to every shivering G1 in the foxholes that the high command was more interested in its own physical safety than in the strategic cohesion or the survival of the men facing the German 10th Panzer Division in the mountain gaps. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, realized with agonizing clarity that the American soldier was not the fundamental problem, but rather a leadership culture that had allowed discipline to wither like a vine in the desert sun, replaced by a lethargic, rear echelon indifference that Rommel's battle-hardened veterans had exploited with surgical, terrifying precision. The failure at Kasserine had exposed a lack of coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery. But more importantly, it revealed a lack of spirit, a vacuum of aggression that needed to be filled before the Axis could solidify their hold on the Tunisian bridgehead. Enter Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr., a man who viewed war not as a bureaucratic exercise or a logistical puzzle, but as a divine, violent calling, arriving at the 2nd Corps headquarters on March 6 around 10 o'clock a.m., with a mandate to extract the cancer of defeatism and replace it with a relentless, aggressive momentum that would tolerate nothing less than total crushing victory. Patton did not just arrive. He erupted into the theater, his presence a calculated explosion of sensory authority designed to shock the system back into a state of combat readiness. Patton's entry into the Tunisian headquarters was a masterclass in psychological theater, rolling into the dusty, lethargic encampment in an open-top command car with sirens wailing and a phalanx of outriders, his tailored uniform immaculate despite the swirling grit, and his ivory-gripped revolvers catching the harsh African sun like beacons of a new, uncompromising era. He did not look like a man who had come to manage a retreat. He looked like a man who had come to lead a crusade, and his eyes, cold and piercing behind his goggles, surveyed the scene with a predatory intensity that made every officer in his vicinity instinctively straighten their spine. Upon his arrival, Patton immediately surveyed the wreckage of the command culture, finding officers lounging in civilian-style sweaters, soldiers wandering without helmets, and a general lack of the crisp, martial urgency that he believed was the fundamental prerequisite for surviving the meat grinder of the Second World War. He saw the rear echelon comforts as a lethal poison, a comfort that bred complacency, and a complacency that led directly to the graves he had seen dotting the landscape near Kasserine. He understood a truth that his predecessors had dangerously ignored, that the soul of an army is reflected in its outward appearance, and that a soldier who is permitted to look like a civilian will eventually begin to think and act like a civilian, a luxury that no man can afford when facing the veteran grenadiers of the Wehrmacht in a life-or-death struggle for the high ground. To Patton, a loose button was the first step toward a lost battle, and he was prepared to be ruthless in his correction of these perceived minor infractions. Patton's first executive action was a psychological hammer blow, issuing an immediate and non-negotiable directive that every officer and enlisted man, from the cooks in the deep rear to the generals at the forward observation posts, would wear full combat gear at all times, including the heavy M1 steel helmet, the restrictive wool necktie, in the full combat web harness with leggings, regardless of the sweltering heat or their proximity to the actual firing line. This order was not about fashion. It was about stripping away the safe identity of the administrative staff and forcing them to physically inhabit the role of a warrior. The order was met with instant bitter resentment from the staff, who viewed the wearing of heavy steel helmets and woolen ties in the blistering Tunisian heat as an act of petty tyranny. Yet Patton knew that this physical discomfort was a necessary ritual of transformation, forcing every man to carry the literal weight of the war on his head and around his neck every waking second of his existence. He wanted them to be uncomfortable. He wanted them to be reminded of the war with every drop of sweat that rolled down their faces, ensuring that the peacetime mindset was well and truly dead. By mandating the steel helmet in the office, Patton was effectively erasing the psychological boundary between the safe, bureaucratic rear and the lethal, chaotic front, signaling that under his command, the entire theater of operations was a combat zone where tactical readiness was the only currency that mattered. He was removing the back area shield that Fredendall had used to hide from the reality of the war, dragging every officer out into the open where they were expected to look and act like the soldiers they were commanding. Consider the symbolic weight of the necktie, a piece of clothing that served no practical purpose in the desert, but acted as a constant, tightening reminder of discipline, a physical leash that forced a man to maintain a rigid posture in a professional bearing, even when the dust of North Africa threatened to choke the very life out of his lungs. It was an aesthetic of iron will, a visual declaration that even in the most chaotic environment, the American officer would maintain his composure, his standards, and his dignity. Patton began a relentless tour of the forward positions, personally finding officers who were caught without their helmets, including high-ranking colonels, not because he cared about the $25 fines, but because he needed to demonstrate that the era of optional discipline was dead and that the price of non-compliance was an immediate, public, and career-ending encounter with his own wrath. He was a visible, unavoidable force, appearing in the most dangerous sectors to ensure that his orders were being followed to the letter, transforming the visual landscape of the Second Corps in less than 48 hours. He was building a radical aesthetic of discipline, a visual front line where the sight of a general in full combat gear inspired a terrifying sense of accountability in his subordinates, forcing them to realize that if the commander was willing to endure the weight and heat of the gear, they had no excuse for their own lethargy. He was rebuilding the chain of command from the outside in, using the uniform as a tool to reform the mind, preparing his officers for the brutal tactical shifts that were about to follow as they moved to reclaim the initiative from the Germans. This was the beginning of the great reconstruction of the American fighting spirit, a process where the outward appearance of the soldier was used as a lever to move the inward character of the man, preparing the Second Corps for the fires of Guettar and the eventual redemption of American arms. Patton had taken a broken, demoralized force and, through the sheer force of his personality and a few pieces of regulation gear, had begun to forge a weapon that could finally stand against the Desert Fox and the Iron Divisions of the Third Reich. The imposition of the steel helmet and the woolen tie was merely the opening movement in Patton's broader, relentless symphony of reorganization, as he moved with a frantic, predatory energy to overhaul the training schedules of every division under his command, demanding that infantry units engage in grueling, live-fire exercises that mimicked the terrifying chaos they would face against the Wehrmacht's combined arms tactics. He did not want office soldiers. He wanted killers who were comfortable with the sound of incoming artillery, and he drove his men until the memory of the Kasserine retreat was buried under a mountain of new aggressive doctrine. He focused his gaze specifically on the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, and the 1st Armored Division, demanding that their commanders, Terry de la Mesa Allen and Orlando Ward, adopt his philosophy of attack, attack, and attack again, emphasizing that speed was the greatest armor an American unit possessed, and that a stationary force was merely a static target for German 88mm flak guns. Patton was a man of motion, and he viewed the defensive mindset of the early Tunisian campaign as a form of cowardice that had to be purged through constant violent action and a refusal to yield the initiative to the enemy. Patton's presence became a ubiquitous, almost supernatural force throughout the Tunisian hills, his command jeep recognizable from miles away by the oversized general's stars and the massive cloud of dust it kicked up as he raced between battalions, frequently jumping out to harangue a tank crew for a dirty gun barrel or to praise a rifleman for a well-maintained foxhole. This hands-on leadership ensured that every soldier, from the highest colonel to the lowest private, felt the direct, unblinking eyes of high command upon them, creating a culture of hypervigilance where failure to maintain standards was no longer an option. Analyze the tactical shift from Fredendall's defensive, static posture to Patton's dynamic, maneuver-oriented doctrine, where he integrated the devastating power of American divisional artillery, utilizing the complex time-on-target barrages, with aggressive armored thrusts creating a symphony of coordinated violence that sought to overwhelm the German decision-making cycle before they could reinforce their mountain strongholds. Patton understood that the Americans had the edge in logistics and firepower, and he intended to use both as a bludgeon to break the back of the Axis resistance in the high desert. Patton's leadership was a direct psychological challenge to the myth of German invincibility that had haunted the U.S. Army since the first shots were fired in North Africa, as he constantly reminded his men that the Germans were not supermen, but merely well-trained soldiers who could be broken by superior firepower and a more ferocious will to kill. He delivered this message in his famous gravel-voiced, blood-and-guts speeches, often standing atop a tank or a crate, his helmet gleaming, his language saltier than the sea, leaving his men either inspired to greatness or terrified of his legendary wrath. The first true test of this reforged army came around 9 a.m. at the Battle of Guettar in late March, where the 1st Infantry Division faced a massive, coordinated counterattack by the 10th Panzer Division, the very same veteran unit that had helped shatter the Americans at Kasserine just weeks prior. The stakes could not have been higher. If the Americans broke here, the road to the sea would be open to the Germans once again, and the entire Allied strategy in North Africa would be thrown into a state of permanent crisis. In the Valley of Guettar, the discipline Patton had instilled bore its first bloody and magnificent fruit, as American infantrymen held their positions under a terrifying rain of Nebelwerfer rockets and mortar fire, their helmets low, their gear tight, and their resolve unshakable, refusing to break even as the panzers lumbered within yards of their foxholes. This was a different army than the one that had fled the Kasserine Pass. These were men who had been forged by Patton's iron standards, and they stood their ground with a professional coldness that stunned the German commanders. The American artillery, coordinated with a precision that would have been impossible under the old disorganized regime, unleashed a localized apocalypse on the advancing German armor, utilizing the time-on-target method to ensure that hundreds of shells landed simultaneously on the panzer formations, turning the valley floor into a charnel house of twisted metal and scorched earth. This victory proved that the Second Corps had finally mastered the art of high-intensity modern combat, and that the days of green American units being bullied by the veterans of the Eastern Front were officially over. Patton watched the battle from a forward observation post, resplendent in his full combat gear, his binoculars fixed on the burning German tanks, witnessing the physical manifestation of his aesthetic of discipline, as his men executed their orders with a precision that mirrored his own personality. He was not a distant manager. He was a witness to the resurrection of an army, and the sight of the 10th Panzer Division retreating in disarray was the ultimate validation of his belief that discipline and aggression were the only two things that mattered in war. The victory at Guettar sent immediate shockwaves through the German high command, as General Jürgen von Arnim realized that the amateur Americans they had laughed at in Kasserine had been replaced by a hardened, disciplined, and dangerously aggressive force that was now capable of trading blows with the best of the Wehrmacht and winning. The Germans began to respect the American soldier, and more importantly, they began to fear the man who led them. The old blood and guts who had turned a defeated rabble into a lethal fighting machine in less than a month. Patton's obsession with the small things, the polished brass, the crisp salutes, the mandatory ties, was revealed to be a masterstroke of psychological conditioning, as these habits of obedience translated directly into the battlefield discipline required to stay in a trench when an 88mm shell is screaming toward your position. By controlling the soldier's appearance, Patton had gained control over the soldier's fear, replacing the instinct to flee with the instinct to follow orders. A transformation that saved countless American lives during the final push through the Tunisian mountains. As the Tunisian campaign reached its climax in May 1943, The Second Corps, now a lean and lethal instrument of war, spearheaded the final assault on Bizerta, capturing the city and forcing the surrender of over 250,000 Axis troops, effectively ending the presence of the Third Reich in North Africa. The victory was total, and the images of thousands of German and Italian prisoners marching into captivity were a stark contrast to the burning American tanks seen at Kasserine just months before. Behold the final poetic irony where the very officers who had mocked Patton's helmet order now marched into the captured streets of Tunis with their heads held high, their uniforms a symbol of their transformation from the rabble of Kasserine to the liberators of Africa. They had learned that Patton's radical aesthetic was not a burden but a shield, a source of pride that distinguished them as the elite vanguard of a new global superpower that was finally ready to take the fight to the heart of Europe. The legacy of Patton's North African command remains a definitive blueprint for how to resurrect a failing organization during a period of extreme crisis, teaching us that when an institution is broken at its core, the solution is not more meetings or better equipment, but a fundamental return to the basic, unyielding principles of discipline, accountability, and leadership by example. Patton proved that one man's iron will can change the culture of 100,000 men, turning the sting of a devastating defeat into the catalyst for an inevitable victory. George S. Patton Jr. did not just win a battle in Tunisia. He forged the soul of the modern American army, proving that in the crucible of war, the difference between a disastrous defeat and a glorious victory is often found in the simple, heavy weight of a steel helmet and the uncompromising spirit of the man who demands it be worn. His name would go on to become synonymous with the aggressive pursuit of total victory. But it was here in the dust of North Africa that the legend was truly born, amid the ruins of Kasserine and the redemption of Guettar. In your opinion, was Patton's decision to enforce strict uniform codes in the desert heat a stroke of psychological genius? Or was it merely the act of a glory-seeking tyrant? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.